Before dawn on August 10th, 1813, the town of St. Michael's lay beside the dark waters of Maryland's eastern shore with no great fortress protecting it, no walls surrounding its streets, and no regular army waiting behind earthworks. It was a shipbuilding town, a place of carpenters, sailors, merchants, craftsmen, families, wharves, timber, rope, canvas, and unfinished hulls. At that hour, most of its people could not see what was moving toward them through the Miles River. Out in the darkness, British war barges were advancing under oars, no walls surrounding its streets, and no regular army waiting behind earthworks. It was a shipbuilding town, a place of carpenters, sailors, merchants, craftsmen, families, wharves, timber, rope, canvas, and unfinished hulls. At that hour, most of its people could not see what was moving toward them through the Miles River. Out in the darkness, British war barges were advancing under oars. Their crews belonged to the most powerful maritime empire on earth. The men in those boats were not sailing toward a famous battlefield or a national capital. They were coming toward a small American community whose importance came from what its shipyards could produce. The British knew that vessels built around the Chesapeake could become privateers, fast-armed ships that slipped into the Atlantic and preyed on British commerce. To the people of St. Michael's, the waterfront was a source of work and survival. To British commanders, it was part of an enemy war machine. In the pre-dawn silence, those two realities were about to collide. A local American battery at Parrott's Point guarded the approach. When the British reached it, the defenders managed to fire warning shots before the position was overrun. The British spiked the cannon, making them difficult to use, but the shots had already done something more important than damage an enemy. They had alerted the town. Militia began to gather. Surprise, the great advantage of a sudden raid was disappearing. The British withdrew toward their vessels, and the sloop conflict opened fire on St. Michael's. Cannon shot and grape shot crossed the air over a place where civilians lived only moments from the water. Houses were struck. A contemporary letter, later printed in Niles' Weekly Register, described grape shot flying through the town and cannonballs passing through several houses, yet no American in the town was reported killed. One projectile was said to have crashed into the home of shipwright William Merchant, helping create the story of the building later remembered as the Cannonball House. By the end of that morning, St. Michael's was still standing. The British had come, the town had been fired upon, and the defenders had not been destroyed. But the people of St. Michael's could not know that the first attack was only the beginning. 16 days later, the British would return with a much larger force, and the small shipbuilding community would again have to decide whether it would stand in their path. To understand why Britain cared enough to attack this town twice, it is necessary to leave that August morning and return to the uneasy years before the War of 1812, when the United States was still a young republic trying to prove that the independence won in the American Revolution could survive in a world dominated by older and stronger powers. Only a generation had passed since George Washington's army had fought the British Empire. The peace that followed independence did not end the rivalry between the United States and Britain. Across the Atlantic world, the Napoleonic Wars transformed trade, diplomacy, and naval warfare. Britain depended on its Royal Navy to protect commerce, blockade enemies, and maintain control of the seas. The United States depended heavily on maritime trade, but American ships moved through waters where British policy could be enforced by British guns. One of the most explosive issues was impressment. The Royal Navy, constantly in need of manpower, stopped vessels and took sailors it claimed were British subjects or deserters. Americans saw this practice as a violation of national sovereignty, especially when men claiming American citizenship were seized. Trade restrictions created additional anger. Britain and France each tried to limit commerce that might help the other, and neutral American merchants were caught in the struggle. Political leaders in Washington argued over how to respond. Some believed the United States had been insulted for too long. Others feared that war against Britain would be economically disastrous and militarily reckless. President James Madison eventually asked Congress for a declaration of war. And on June 18, 1812, the United States formally entered another conflict with Britain. Americans disagreed sharply over the decision. The war was not a moment of perfect national unity. Regional interests, party politics, commercial concerns, frontier ambitions, and arguments about maritime rights all shaped the debate. Yet once fighting began, communities along the coast had to face a practical reality that political speeches could not change. Britain possessed a navy vastly more powerful than the small naval establishment of the United States. America could win individual engagements at sea, and several early frigate victories gave the young nation confidence. But the Royal Navy had the ships and experience to impose blockades and move forces along vulnerable coastlines. The Chesapeake Bay was particularly exposed. It was not simply a large body of water. It was a vast network of rivers, creeks, inlets, islands, farms, towns, shipyards, and ports, reaching deep into Maryland and Virginia. Waterways connected the bay with important population centers and with routes leading toward Washington and Baltimore. A naval force that controlled the Chesapeake could threaten communities far inland without marching hundreds of miles overland. British commanders understood this geography. In 1813, Rear Admiral George Cockburn brought British warships into the Chesapeake and helped turn the region into a theater of raids, blockades, destruction, intimidation, and rapid amphibious operations. The strategy was flexible. British sailors and Marines could approach by ship, transfer into smaller boats, land where local defenses were weak, destroy military stores or vessels, seize supplies, and return to the fleet before larger American forces could assemble. The effect extended beyond the physical damage. Every sail spotted on the horizon could produce fear. Every report of a burned town could force militia elsewhere to prepare for an attack that might never come. Every British landing could pull American attention away from another target. Communities along the bay began to understand that the war was no longer an argument debated in Congress or a campaign fought along the Canadian border. It had arrived at their doors. Havre de Grace was attacked in May 1813. British forces burned buildings and destroyed property. Other settlements on Maryland's eastern shore and around the Chesapeake experienced raids, skirmishes, plundering, and threats. Georgetown and Fredericktown suffered British attacks. Queenstown would be targeted. Farms could lose livestock and provisions. Storehouses and vessels were vulnerable. The geography that had made the Chesapeake productive in peace made it difficult to defend in war. There were too many waterways and too many possible landing places. A defender could not know whether a British force seen in one creek intended to raid the nearest village, strike a military position, gather provisions, or merely create confusion while another force moved elsewhere. Britain did not need to occupy every town. It could use mobility to force Americans to live under the possibility of attack. St. Michael's stood within this dangerous landscape. Its streets did not make it famous, but its shipyards made it useful. Maryland's eastern shore had a strong maritime culture, and St. Michael's had become known as a place where skilled shipwrights could produce fast vessels suited to the Chesapeake and the open sea. During the War of 1812, privateering gave communities like this a strategic significance far beyond their size. A privateer was not a pirate in the legal meaning understood by the governments that authorized the practice. Private ships could receive commissions, allowing them to capture enemy merchant vessels and profit from condemned prizes. For the United States, whose regular navy was small compared with Britain's, privateers offered a way to strike at British commerce. They could not defeat the Royal Navy in a conventional fleet battle, but they could impose costs, force escorts to protect merchant traffic, and make the war less predictable for British trade. Fast Chesapeake schooners were well suited to this work. Their speed and handling could make them difficult targets, and British commanders had reason to treat shipbuilding centers that supported privateering as legitimate military objectives. St. Michael's had launched at least several successful privateers, and vessels connected with American defense of the Chesapeake were also built there. That meant the quiet appearance of the town concealed a strategic fact. A hull taking shape beside the water might one day carry guns and men into the Atlantic. A carpenter shaping timber was also contributing, however indirectly, to the war. A shipyard that survived one season might launch vessels that threatened British shipping in the next. For Britain, destroying such capacity could be more valuable than capturing a few houses or occupying a village for a day. For the Americans who lived there, however, the shipyards were not abstractions. They were livelihoods. They represented years of skill, investment, and local knowledge. Destroying them would damage not only military potential, but the economic life of families whose survival depended on maritime work. This is what made the coming confrontation so personal. The British could see St. Michael's as a target on a chart. The people on shore saw homes, workshops, churches, streets, neighbors, and the accumulated labor of a community. By the summer of 1813, those people had reasons to fear what would happen if British forces reached the town. Reports from elsewhere made the danger clear. British raids had shown that waterfront settlements could be entered quickly and that resistance might lead to destruction. Local militia therefore became essential. In the early Republic, militia service tied civilian life directly to military responsibility. Many defenders were not full-time soldiers. They were farmers, tradesmen, merchants, and workers called upon to train and serve when danger threatened. They did not possess the discipline or long experience of professional British troops, but they knew the terrain, had a direct reason to defend it, and could assemble in numbers if given enough warning. That last condition mattered. A surprise landing could scatter defenders before they formed. A warning shot, a messenger, or a few extra minutes could change the balance of a raid. At St. Michael's, the battery near Parrott's Point existed partly to provide the first line of resistance and observation. The men there could not stop an entire British force by themselves, but they could make an unseen attack visible. As August began, residents watched the surrounding waterways with growing anxiety. The enemy had already demonstrated its reach. Rumors moved faster than confirmed information. A British ship seen at a distance might be heading somewhere else, or it might be searching for the best approach to St. Michael's. Families had to decide how seriously to take each warning. Leaving home every time a sail appeared was impossible. Ignoring every report was dangerous. Militia officers faced the same uncertainty on a larger scale. Men could not remain permanently under arms while farms, shops, and businesses went unattended, yet if they dispersed too widely, a British landing might occur before they could concentrate. This tension between ordinary life and sudden military danger defined much of the Chesapeake War. The people of St. Michael's lived inside that uncertainty until the night of August 9th, when possibility became movement on the water. The British had chosen their moment. Their barges moved into the Miles River before dawn on August 10th. A dozen small craft carrying armed men could approach more quietly and in shallower water than a large warship. Oars offered control where sails might reveal movement or depend on the wind. In darkness, the coastline could hide an attacking force until it was close. The British objective was to reach the town before its defenders were fully ready. They did not need to defeat an army in the field. They needed speed, shock, and confusion. At Parrott's Point, however, the American battery disrupted that plan. The defenders fired before they were overwhelmed. British troops took the position and spiked the guns, driving metal into the cannon's firing mechanism so the pieces could not easily be turned against them. Militarily, the battery had been neutralized. Strategically, it had already succeeded in its most important task. The sound of cannon traveled. Men in St. Michael's understood what it meant. Militia began to gather, and the British now faced the prospect of moving toward a town whose defenders knew they were coming. A raid designed around surprise was becoming a confrontation. The British pulled back. From the river, conflict fired into the town. It was a violent reminder that withdrawal from the shore did not mean safety. Naval artillery could still reach buildings from the water. Grapeshot, designed to spread multiple projectiles, could be terrifying against exposed men. Round shot could tear through timber, roofs, walls, and anything in its path. Yet the bombardment did not produce the destruction the people of St. Michael's had feared. Houses were damaged, but the town was not burned. American accounts emphasize the extraordinary absence of casualties, despite the intensity of the firing. When the sound finally faded and the British moved away down the Miles River, people emerged into a town that had been attacked but not conquered. The first immediate question was simple. Were they coming back? No one could know the answer, but everything about the broader Chesapeake campaign suggested that British commanders were capable of returning wherever they believed unfinished business remained. In the days after August 10th, the people of St. Michael's had time to examine what had happened, and memory immediately began its complicated work. Battles and raids rarely survive in public memory exactly as they were experienced. Fear becomes courage, confusion becomes a clear sequence, coincidence becomes strategy, and stories that capture the spirit of a community can become more durable than the uncertain details preserved in official reports. St. Michael's would eventually become famous for one such story. According to local tradition, residents deliberately extinguished ordinary lights and then placed lanterns high in trees, on masts, or above buildings. The purpose, the story says, was to deceive British gunners about the true elevation of the town so that their cannon fire would pass overhead. It is a wonderful story because it transforms frightened civilians into clever participants in their own defense. Instead of merely enduring a bombardment, the town outwits the Royal Navy. The phrase, "the town that fooled the British," grew from this tradition and became part of the identity of St. Michael's. But a responsible telling of the event must separate the appeal of the legend from the evidence. The National Park Service has pointed out serious problems with taking the lantern story literally. The cannonading on August 10th occurred when daylight, though perhaps overcast, made the town visible. More importantly, British shot did not simply sail harmlessly over St. Michael's. Several buildings were struck. The reported projectile that entered William Merchant's house is one of the most memorable examples. If the British were entirely deceived about the town's location or elevation, those hits are difficult to explain. None of this proves that no lanterns were ever raised. It means that historians cannot confidently say the lantern trick saved St. Michael's. The distinction matters because the documented story is dramatic enough without invention. None of this proves that no lanterns were ever raised. It means that historians cannot confidently say the lantern trick saved St. Michael's. The distinction matters because the documented story is dramatic enough without invention. A small shipbuilding community was attacked by British forces. Its warning battery was overrun. Naval guns fired into its streets. Houses were damaged. And yet the town avoided the kind of devastation suffered elsewhere in the Chesapeake. The legend may reveal how later generations wanted to remember the event, but the survival of St. Michael's does not depend on the legend being true. In fact, the uncertainty makes the story more interesting. It allows us to see how history and memory grow together. One is built from reports, letters, military movements, surviving buildings, and contemporary testimony. The other is built from what communities repeat because a story expresses something they believe about themselves. St. Michael's came to see itself as resourceful, stubborn, and difficult to intimidate. Whether lanterns changed the path of a single British cannonball is less certain than the fact that this identity lasted. In August 1813, however, no one had the luxury of thinking about legend. The people who had just survived the first attack were living in the present tense, and the present remained dangerous. British forces had not left the Chesapeake. The shipyards still existed. The militia had shown that it would assemble. From the British perspective, the first operation had not eliminated the town's military usefulness. The possibility of a second attack therefore hung over every repair and every conversation. Damaged houses could be patched, but residents could not repair the larger strategic situation. British ships still controlled movement across much of the bay. Damaged houses could be patched, but residents could not repair the larger strategic situation. British ships still controlled movement across much of the bay. American defenders still lacked the naval strength to force them away. The Royal Navy could choose the next point of pressure. St. Michael's could prepare, but preparation had limits. American defenders still lacked the naval strength to force them away. The Royal Navy could choose the next point of pressure. St. Michael's could prepare, but preparation had limits. A town could station militia, watch the river, and maintain artillery, yet it could not know whether the enemy would return with the same dozen barges or with hundreds of men. 16 days after the first assault, that uncertainty ended. On August 26th, the British came back, and this time the scale was dramatically larger. The operation involved roughly 2,100 men moving in about 60 barges. Yet it could not know whether the enemy would return with the same dozen barges or with hundreds of men. 16 days after the first assault, that uncertainty ended. On August 26th, the British came back, and this time the scale was dramatically larger. The operation involved roughly 2,100 men moving in about 60 barges. Compared with the earlier pre-dawn raid, this was a far more serious concentration of force. The number alone changed the meaning of the threat. Hundreds of armed men might raid a position. More than 2,000 could overwhelm local resistance if properly deployed. They could march inland, destroy shipyards, scatter militia, and potentially punish the town for having resisted before. For residents who had already heard British cannon, the return must have confirmed the worst possibility. The first attack had not persuaded the enemy to forget St. Michael's. The British force landed about 6 miles from town near Wade's Point. From there, the operation divided. Around 300 men were sent toward a nearby militia camp, while a much larger body moved in the direction of St. Michael's. Other British troops and barges operated on the water. The movement was not simply a straight rush down one road. Like many amphibious operations, it depended on coordination between landing parties, boats, officers, and separate objectives. That complexity could create strength, but it could also create uncertainty. The British needed to know where the Americans were, whether militia might strike their flanks, and how much resistance awaited near town. The Americans, meanwhile, had something they lacked on August 10th, warning. They knew an attack was underway and had time to assemble more deliberately. Roughly 500 defenders gathered to oppose the advancing British. They were supported by artillery and cavalry. 500 against approximately 1,800 advancing troops was still a severe numerical disadvantage. But numbers by themselves do not determine whether an attack succeeds. Terrain matters, readiness matters, firepower matters. The attacker must decide whether the objective is worth the casualties required to reach it. And perhaps most importantly, commanders act with incomplete information. Neither side could see the entire battlefield, as if looking at a map drawn after the event. Men on the road saw smoke, trees, fences, fields, dust, uniforms, and flashes of gunfire. Officers received reports that could already be outdated by the time they arrived. A force moving toward an unfamiliar town had to ask what might be hidden beyond the visible line. The American militia had to ask whether the British column in front of them was the main force or merely one part of a wider encirclement. The confrontation developed about 1.5 miles from St. Michael's. There, the British advance encountered the American defenders. The distance from the town is important. The militia did not simply wait among houses and hope the British would choose not to enter. They moved out to confront the threat before it reached the center of the community. The British saw an organized line in their path, not a deserted settlement. Volleys were exchanged. Gunfire cracked across the landscape. Artillery and cavalry gave the American position an appearance of greater strength and organization than raw militia numbers alone might suggest. Yet the engagement did not turn into the prolonged, bloody battle that the numbers seemed to promise. After only a few volleys, the British withdrew. To a modern reader, the suddenness can feel almost anticlimactic. More than 2,000 British troops had been committed to the operation. Around 1,800 moved toward St. Michael's. 500 Americans stood against them. It is tempting to imagine a decisive clash, in which the smaller force dramatically destroys or routs the larger. That is not what the evidence supports. The encounter was brief. The British chose not to press the attack. This does not make the event insignificant. On the contrary, it reveals something important about real warfare. Commanders do not always fight simply because they have more men. An assault requires a purpose, and every purpose must be measured against risk. The British campaign in the Chesapeake was built on mobility. Raiding forces created disruption because they could appear quickly, strike exposed targets, and leave before local resistance hardened. If a target was already alerted and defended, the value of a direct attack changed. St. Michael's was important because of shipbuilding, but it was not a fortress whose capture would decide the war. If pushing through prepared militia meant casualties, delay, or the possibility of being drawn into a larger engagement while operating away from the fleet, withdrawal could be rational. The Americans did not need to annihilate the British force. They needed to make the cost of advancing appear greater than the benefit. The presence of artillery and cavalry may have contributed to that calculation. So may the loss of surprise. So may uncertainty about additional American forces. British commanders had other objectives in the region, and no reason to sacrifice men simply to prove that they could enter a small town. The exact mixture of factors is difficult to reconstruct with certainty, and it would be misleading to invent a single dramatic explanation. What is clear is the result. The British did not force their way into St. Michael's. They departed. For the second time in the same month, the town remained beyond their grasp. The emotional effect of that withdrawal is easier to imagine than the tactical details are to prove. Residents who had already survived bombardment now learned that a much larger British force had approached and turned back after encountering local defenders. Men who had assembled as militia could return with the knowledge that simply being present, armed, and organized had mattered. Families who had feared burning houses and destroyed shipyards could look around and see the town still intact. The victory, if we use that word, was not the kind celebrated with captured standards and rows of prisoners. It was defensive and local. The important fact was what had not happened. St. Michael's had not been occupied. Its shipyards had not been wiped from the shoreline. Its streets had not become the scene of prolonged close fighting. Its residents had not been driven into the countryside by a successful British assault. In wars remembered through large battles, this kind of outcome can disappear. Histories naturally focus on armies destroyed, capitals captured, treaties signed, and generals made famous. But for civilians, survival often depends on events that end without a dramatic climax. A force turns away. A raid is abandoned. A cannon shot misses. A warning arrives in time. A road is defended long enough to change an enemy commander's judgment. These moments can determine whether a town exists the next morning, much as it did the day before. St. Michael's was one of those places. The second British withdrawal also complicates the popular lantern legend. If the town's identity rested only on the idea of fooling British gunners during the first attack, then the events of August 26th are easy to overlook. Yet, the second confrontation may reveal more about the actual resilience of St. Michael's than the lantern story does. There was no need for a clever trick to explain the outcome. Hundreds of militia confronted a much larger attacking force. The British exchanged fire and chose to leave. The town's survival was linked not to magic or myth, but to preparation, local organization, and the strategic limits of raiding warfare. That does not make the story less cinematic, it makes it more human. The defenders did not know in advance that the British would retreat after a few volleys. When they took position, they had to consider the possibility that 1,800 men might keep coming. A militia line facing such a force could not assume that history would remember them kindly. Each man had to stand while the future remained uncertain. The courage in that moment came from not knowing what would happen. To understand why the British might have stopped, it helps to understand the kind of campaign they were fighting. The Chesapeake operations of 1813 were not a straightforward attempt to conquer and permanently occupy Maryland. Britain used naval superiority to pressure the American coast, damage resources, disrupt trade, collect supplies, and force the United States to defend numerous vulnerable points. This method created a constant asymmetry. The British could move by water and decide where to threaten. The Americans had to defend land with incomplete information. But mobility was useful, only so long as a raiding force remained mobile. If British troops became tied down in a stubborn inland fight, the advantage could shrink. A quick expedition might turn into a costly battle with little strategic return. The Americans knew this too, even if they did not express it in modern military language. Their task was often to make a town look harder to take than it had appeared from the deck of a ship. At St. Michael's on August 26th, that seems to be what happened. The defenders represented enough resistance to alter the British decision. This broader pattern also explains why the Chesapeake experienced so many raids rather than a continuous front line. There were no trenches stretching across Maryland. The war moved along water and roads in bursts. One week a village might be terrified by the approach of boats. The next week the danger might shift dozens of miles away. Militia could fight a skirmish, disperse, return to civilian life, and then be called out again. British crews could raid farms, destroy vessels, and vanish back into the bay. The boundary between battlefield and home was therefore unusually thin. A farmer's field could become a line of advance. A shipyard could become a military objective. A family house could be struck by naval shot. A local road could become the place where hundreds of armed men decided whether a town would burn. The people of St. Michael's experienced this collapse of distance twice in August 1813. War arrived not as a grand army marching beneath banners, but first as barges in darkness, then as a large amphibious force advancing from a landing point. The first time, warning shots and gathering militia helped deny surprise. The second time, an organized defensive line helped deny the enemy an easy advance. Both outcomes depended on people responding quickly to a threat they could not fully measure. After August 26th, the immediate pressure on St. Michael's eased, but the Chesapeake War did not. British power remained on the water, and the eastern shore continued to experience danger. The region's role in the War of 1812 is often overshadowed by events that came later, especially the burning of Washington and the defense of Baltimore in 1814. Yet the eastern shore had already become a proving ground for the methods the British would use. Blockade, raids, amphibious landings, destruction of property, pressure on local militia, and the exploitation of waterways. St. Michael's was one episode in a much larger campaign, but it captured the central problem facing Americans along the bay. How could a young nation with limited naval strength protect hundreds of miles of exposed shoreline against an enemy that could choose where and when to appear? There was no single answer. Sometimes communities suffered terrible damage. Sometimes militia arrived too late. Sometimes British forces withdrew and resistance stiffened. St. Michael's was fortunate, but its fortune was combined with action. The town had warning positions, men assembled, guns fired, a defensive line formed. These practical facts matter more than the mythology that later grew around them. To see the events only through troop numbers, however, would miss the experience of the people who lived through them. For residents of St. Michael's, August 1813 was not a sequence of neat military phases. It was a month in which ordinary routines were repeatedly interrupted by the possibility of violence. The men who served in militia units were also sons, fathers, employers, workers, neighbors, and customers. When they left homes and shops to assemble, the work they normally performed stopped. A shipwright who carried a musket could not shape timber at the same time. A farmer watching a road for British troops was not tending his fields. A merchant listening for news from the river could not know whether the next day would bring trade or destruction. Families were forced to measure danger without reliable information. They might hear that British boats had been seen, but not know whether those boats were headed toward St. Michael's. They might know that militia had gone out, but not know how many men stood against them. They might hear cannon and be unable to tell whether the sound meant a successful defense or the beginning of an enemy advance. This uncertainty is difficult to recover from official records because military documents tend to record movements, numbers, positions, casualties, and orders. Fear leaves fewer written traces. Yet it shaped the lives of everyone in a threatened town. The damage from the first bombardment made that fear physical. A wall pierced by shot or a roof damaged by a cannonball was evidence that the Royal Navy could reach into a private home from the river. The people who inspected those buildings afterward did not need a strategic map to understand the war. They could touch the splintered wood. They could see where a projectile had passed. They could imagine how small a difference in direction might have produced a death. That is one reason the reported absence of American fatalities during the August 10th bombardment became so memorable. Survival felt improbable because the violence had been real. The phrase from the contemporary account describing grape shot flying through the town captures something statistics cannot. A place can be under fire without becoming a famous battlefield. Civilians can experience terror even when the casualty list remains short. The same is true of the second attack. A few volleys may sound minor when compared with battles lasting hours or days, but the men standing in the American line did not know the exchange would be brief until it ended. Every shot was fired into an uncertain future. If the British had continued advancing, the defenders might have been forced back toward the town. If the American line had broken, fighting could have reached the streets and shipyards. If British commanders had decided that destroying St. Michael's was worth a heavier cost, the day might have ended very differently. The fact that those possibilities did not occur should not erase the seriousness of the moment. Historical outcomes often make danger look smaller in retrospect. Once we know that St. Michael's survived, it is easy to imagine that survival was inevitable. It was not. Other Chesapeake communities had already shown what could happen when British raiders entered a town. Buildings could be burned, supplies could be seized, vessels could be destroyed. The people of St. Michael's had every reason to believe the same fate might reach them. Their relief after the second withdrawal therefore belonged to a broader geography of fear stretching around the bay. Maryland's eastern shore experienced battles, skirmishes, and repeated British raids during the war. The region is sometimes treated as a side story because the most famous Chesapeake events happened elsewhere. Washington, Baltimore, and Fort McHenry dominate popular memory. Yet the eastern shore demonstrates how naval war affected smaller communities long before the national capital burned. The British did not need to capture a major city to make their presence felt. By threatening many towns, they forced the United States to spend men, weapons, and attention across a wide area. This was one of the fundamental advantages of sea power. A fleet could create multiple possible crises at once. A defender could not be certain which threat was real until the landing began. That pressure reached St. Michael's because its shipbuilding made it part of a maritime conflict larger than the town itself. Privateers are essential to understanding that connection. At the beginning of the war, the United States could not match Britain ship for ship. American privateers helped compensate by attacking commerce. Their legal status came from government authorization, but their ownership and profit motive were private. This arrangement combined national strategy with individual enterprise. Owners invested money in vessels and crews in the hope that captured enemy ships and cargoes would produce prizes. Sailors accepted risks in exchange for the possibility of reward. British merchants and insurers felt the effects far from the Chesapeake. Every successful American privateer forced Britain to consider convoy protection, escorts, and the vulnerability of trade routes. A town capable of building fast privateering schooners therefore contributed to a dispersed form of economic warfare. St. Michael's was one such place. Its importance did not come from political power or population. It came from maritime skill. The same craftsmen who understood how to build vessels for commerce could build hulls useful in war. The curves of a schooner, the placement of masts, the quality of timber, and the knowledge of local waters all became part of national defense. This helps explain why the British returned after the first operation failed to produce a decisive result. The shipyards were still there. The capability was still there, yet the second withdrawal showed the limit of British power. Naval superiority could bring a large force close to St. Michael's, but it did not automatically guarantee that commanders would accept every risk required to destroy a target. Geography created opportunities for both sides. The waterways allowed the British to approach, but roads and inland positions allowed militia to meet them. Local knowledge helped Americans organize. The mere existence of a defensive line could alter calculations. War is full of such thresholds. Below a certain level of resistance, a raid proceeds. Above it, the same objective may no longer be worth pursuing. The defenders of St. Michael's did not need to overpower the British Empire. They only needed to push one local decision across that threshold. In that sense, the town's story is less about defeating Britain than about denying Britain an easy victory. That distinction gives the episode its proper scale. St. Michael's did not change the outcome of the War of 1812 by itself. The British withdrawals there did not end the Chesapeake campaign. No treaty was signed because of the militia's stand. But local history does not need to be globally decisive to be meaningful. For the people whose homes were at stake, the survival of the town was decisive enough. Their workshops remained. Their streets remained. Their community continued. The British moved on to other objectives, and the war carried its violence elsewhere. In 1814, the Chesapeake would witness an even more ambitious British campaign. Forces moved against Washington. At Bladensburg, American defenders were defeated and British troops entered the capital on August 24th. Government buildings, including the Capitol and the President's House, were burned. The spectacle demonstrated just how vulnerable the young United States remained. The nation that had defeated Britain in the Revolution saw enemy troops occupy its capital little more than 3 decades later. The shock reverberated far beyond Maryland. Yet the British campaign did not end at Washington. Baltimore, a major port and center of privateering, was an obvious next target. There, American defenses were stronger and more concentrated. The attack on Baltimore produced the Battle of North Point and the bombardment of Fort McHenry. During the night of September 13th and into the morning of September 14th, British warships fired on the fort while Francis Scott Key watched from a vessel in the Patapsco River. Seeing the American flag still flying after the bombardment inspired the poem that would eventually become the lyrics of the United States national anthem. Those events became symbols recognized around the world. St. Michael's did not receive the same fame. There was no national anthem born from its defense, no burning Capitol, no enormous monument marking the place where an army was stopped. Its story remained smaller and more local, preserved through buildings, community memory, historical research, and the irresistible legend of lanterns raised against British guns. Yet placing St. Michael's beside the later events of 1814 reveals continuity. The same Chesapeake geography connected all of them. The same British ability to move by water created the threat. The same American dependence on militia and prepared positions shaped resistance. The same tension between naval power and local defense appeared repeatedly. St. Michael's experienced an early version of a struggle that would become more famous around Washington and Baltimore. Its residents learned in 1813 what many Americans would learn in 1814. Control of the water could bring an enemy frighteningly close, but control of the water did not guarantee control of the land. The War of 1812 eventually ended without the clear conquest either side might have imagined at the beginning. The Treaty of Ghent restored peace in late 1814, though fighting continued in some places before news of the agreement arrived. The United States survived the conflict. Britain remained a global maritime power. Many of the maritime issues that had contributed to the war faded in importance as the Napoleonic Wars ended. Americans later remembered the conflict in ways that emphasized national survival. Famous naval victories, the defense of Baltimore, and Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans. Local episodes, such as St. Michael's, fit awkwardly into that larger national story because they were neither spectacular triumphs nor catastrophic defeats. They belonged to the quieter category of places that endured. Over time, however, communities create their own ways of preserving meaning. In St. Michael's, the lantern story offered a perfect symbol. It turned vulnerability into cleverness. Instead of a town exposed to naval artillery, it imagined a town that manipulated the enemy's aim. Instead of ordinary residents waiting helplessly for shells, it imagined residents actively confusing British gunners. The story is so satisfying that it is easy to understand why it survived. Historical evidence, however, asks us to hold two ideas at once. The legend is part of the town's cultural memory, and the legend is not securely established as the explanation for what happened. Saying this does not diminish St. Michael's. It allows the documented events to stand on their own. On August 10th, a dozen British war barges entered the Miles River. British forces overran the American battery at Parrott's Point and spiked its cannon, but the defenders had fired warning shots. Militia gathered. The British withdrew from the land operation. The conflict bombarded the town, damaging houses. Contemporary testimony described intense fire, but no American fatalities in the town. 16 days later, the British returned on a much larger scale. Roughly 2,100 men moved in around 60 barges. The force landed about 6 miles away. Around 300 were directed toward a nearby militia camp, while approximately 1,800 advanced toward St. Michael's. About 500 Americans, supported by cavalry and artillery, confronted them roughly 1.5 miles from town. After a few volleys, the British withdrew. These facts are strong enough. They require no invisible army, no miraculous weapon, and no invented speech by a heroic commander. They show how readiness, warning, local resistance, and an enemy's strategic calculation can combine to save a community. They also show why the phrase, "defy the British," should be understood carefully. The people of St. Michael's did not defeat the Royal Navy in a grand battle. They resisted to attack successfully enough that the British failed to enter and destroy the town. That is a more precise achievement, but not a smaller one to the people who lived there. Imagine the emotional distance between the beginning and end of that August. At the start of the month, St. Michael's was a vulnerable shipbuilding center, wondering when British power might reach it. By the end, residents had heard enemy cannon, seen damaged houses, watched militia gather, learned of a massive second landing, and then watched the danger withdraw again. They had lived through 2 moments when the future of their town seemed uncertain. Their survival could not have felt like an abstract strategic result. It was measured in familiar things that remained where they belonged. A doorway still standing, a workshop not burned, a vessel still on the stocks, a street not occupied by enemy troops, a family returning to its own house. War often enters history through maps covered with arrows. For civilians, it enters through sound. Oars on water, a warning gun before sunrise, muskets in the distance, cannon fire from a sloop, horses carrying militia along a road. Then, perhaps most powerful of all, silence after the enemy has gone. More than 2 centuries later, the physical landscape has changed. Modern visitors can travel through St. Michael's without hearing warning cannon or fearing British barges on the Miles River. The town is now associated with maritime heritage, tourism, preserved architecture, and the history of the Chesapeake. The distance of time can make 1813 feel almost unreal. British redcoats, militia muskets, privateering schooners, and spiked cannon seem to belong to another world. But the waterways remain, and geography helps restore the logic of the story. Stand near the water and the vulnerability becomes easier to understand. A river is not only a scenic boundary. In wartime, it can be a road. The same channel that carries trade can carry an enemy. The same shipbuilding skill that creates prosperity can make a town a target. The same open shoreline that connects a community with the world can expose it to danger from the world. This dual nature of the Chesapeake shaped St. Michael's before, during, and after the War of 1812. It also explains why the story continues to resonate. It is a story about a small place caught inside a global conflict. Britain was fighting as a world power. The United States was struggling to defend its sovereignty and prove the durability of its republic. Across oceans, fleets and armies moved in campaigns involving empires. Yet those enormous forces were translated into immediate choices in St. Michael's. Fire the warning gun or remain silent, assemble the militia or stay home, hold a defensive position or abandon the road. Global history became local in the space between the Miles River and a Maryland town. The people making those choices could not know how historians would later describe the war. They did not know which battles would become famous or which legends would survive. They knew only that armed men were approaching and that something they valued stood behind them. That is, the atmosphere a documentary account should preserve. The defenders were not characters moving toward a predetermined ending. They were people acting without certainty. The British were not foolish villains blindly walking into a trap. They were experienced military professionals making decisions under operational limits. The Lantern story is not worthless because it may be legend. It tells us how communities transform danger into memory. The absence of a catastrophic battle is not evidence that nothing important happened. It is evidence that sometimes successful defense is measured by the disaster that never occurs. If St. Michael's had been burned in August 1813, its name might appear in histories alongside other Chesapeake communities devastated by raids. Instead, the town became remembered for escape, resistance, and a question mark. Did it really fool the British? Perhaps that question has helped keep the story alive because it invites every generation to investigate. The best answer is more nuanced than the legend. There may have been lanterns, but available evidence does not allow us to say they caused British gunners to miss. There was, however, a warning battery. There was militia resistance, there were British cannonballs hitting buildings. There was a second attack by a force far larger than the first. There were Americans who stood in its path, and there was a British withdrawal. History sometimes becomes stronger when mystery is left unresolved. We do not need to replace uncertainty with invention. We can allow the unanswered part to remain unanswered while recognizing what is known. The town survived 2 enemy assaults in August 1813. That is the foundation. Everything else should be built carefully around it. So return one final time to the water before dawn. Picture the Miles River in darkness, the shape of low barges moving quietly toward shore and men rowing beneath a sky that offered little warning of what the morning would bring. Ahead lay a town whose residents were not famous soldiers and whose streets held no grand national monuments. The British approached because the town mattered to the maritime war. At Parrott's Point, American guns broke the silence. The position fell, but the warning traveled. Militia assembled. Surprise disappeared. Conflict fired toward the houses, and shot passed through the town. St. Michael's endured. Then imagine the same community 16 days later, no longer surprised by the nature of the threat. This time the scale was larger. Dozens of barges, thousands of men, a landing several miles away, columns advancing inland. Against them stood a few hundred defenders. There was no guarantee that courage would be enough. There rarely is. But when the forces met outside town, the Americans held long enough to present the British with a choice. After a brief exchange, the larger force turned back. The town remained. In later years, lanterns would rise in the story, glowing high above roofs and masts, giving St. Michael's a nickname that generations would repeat. Perhaps those lights were real. Perhaps the tale grew brighter with every retelling. Either way, the deeper truth does not depend on them. The most remarkable part of the story is not that a handful of lanterns may have deceived the British. It is that a small American shipbuilding community, exposed on the Chesapeake and targeted by the strongest naval power of its age, faced 2 attacks in a single month and survived both. Its people did not know they were living inside a legend. They knew only that the enemy had come down the river, that homes and livelihoods were at risk, and that someone had to stand between the approaching force and the town behind them. More than 200 years later, that is what remains when the smoke, rumor, and mythology are stripped away. A dark river, a warning shot, a community under fire, a defensive line on a Maryland road, and a town still standing when the British were gone.